Aboaboye Boshishe is Aifa Kolade Umilade Fatosin. I'm the author, I'm the founder, and the priestess here with Sacred Waters Healing Temple, and welcome. I have a message for you today coming from Òfún Osa or Òfún Sa. People always say that there is light at the end of the tunnel, but nobody talks about what happens inside the tunnel. Nobody talks about what you have to endure before you ever see the light at the end of the tunnel, or whatever is being sacrificed, what you have to learn, what is even developing in darkness, right? But Òfún Osa or Òfún Sa makes me think about that space. It's the place between conception and manifestation or birth, between what exists spiritually and what has finally taken place in a physical form. Because darkness does not always mean that something is lost. Something in that field sometimes says that darkness is simply where something is being conceived in thought and manifested and built up, right? The easiest example that comes to me is the idea of pregnancy, right? A child spends roughly 40 weeks developing in darkness, surrounded by water, completely dependent upon the environment. It shows, before the baby even sees the mother's face or the father's physical presence or the emotional environment that has already been part of the experience while in development, right? Nobody really acknowledges that, but I just have to think about it. The birth comes in the end. Conception is first. What existed in darkness has now been brought into light. If that makes sense. Okay. That's one way that I like to think about Òfún and Osa being brought together. Òfún speaks of elimination, consciousness, clarity, responsibility, and the awareness that comes when something is being brought to light. Osa takes us into the concealed and mysterious womb, the feminine creative power, movement, gestation, transformation, and forces operating before their results even come, before the birth even happens. So when I put these two together, I think about something developing where I cannot yet see it, while consciousness is preparing me to eventually understand what has been produced. And that to me is what life is about. We arrive here through a womb, but once we get here, we're still being developed, especially during childhood. Other people are planting things into us and before us, making sure that they teach us things before we even really fully understand what it is. And a child who is constantly hearing what they are told, especially if it's something negative, like if they're incapable of doing things, right? All of that type of stuff gets planted inside of them and can affect them in the long run. But if you have someone that's creating a culture for you, or for you to exist in your strengths, then the environment shifts entirely differently, and it ultimately determines the entirety of your destiny and how well influenced and how well you're able to navigate that path for you. And then eventually you have to start making your own moves. This brings me to a story of Òfún Osa and what others call him Òfún Sa. In the story, Orunmila has a child named Ebo. Orunmila and Ebo resided in a small roadside neighborhood where everybody knew everybody. Kids rode bikes from one end of the street to the other, going around the corner. Much of the people were familiar with each other. Somebody's grandmother was always sitting on the porch. Somebody's grandfather's probably somewhere, fishing somewhere. It's like the neighborhood was so familiar with one another that families were close. And while Orunmila was raising his son the intentional way, he understood that what he instilled into his son will ultimately cultivate his reality. What it seemed like to me was that Orunmila understood his son's purpose in life, and he wanted to be sure that his son knew how to handle and navigate that world. He knew eventually his son would have to navigate the world that wasn't going to exactly explain itself before anything, but it was going to test him. So he taught him to be confident, know himself, and trust himself. When Ebo was young, when he was little, Orumila brought him toys, you know, and he didn't just hand it to him. You know, if Ebo had 10 toys and another child had 9, Orumila would ask, "What are you gonna do with all 10 of those?" You know, and Ebo would look at the child. You know, he was like eventually think like, "Well, I guess I could share." Orumila never ever called it what it was, but he was teaching him. When Ebo got older, Orumila started to make him, you know, take on other responsibilities, like taking the water out, you know, taking it out so that he'd be able to water plants, or even taking water out to the neighbors as they're doing lawn work or something like that. But Ebo hated it sometimes. He'd ask like, why everybody else get to have why everybody else get to do whatever they want to do, but I have to do X, Y, and Z. I don't even get to go out and have fun. And, you know, Ebo just really like, I don't ever get to do anything. Just like, I got to do all of this. Then he realized that Ebo was like, he would learn one day. Next, Orumila started having him care for the animals. Orumila wouldn't even let him have a dog until he proved that he could consistently care for something outside of himself. You know, feeding an animal when you felt like it was just not enough. The animals had to eat when you're sleepy. You know, you might be irritated, busy, you want to go out and play or do something like that. No, Orumila was teaching Ebo that responsibility is also an offering. Sometimes what you sacrifice, not necessarily money, sometimes comes with inconvenience, okay? And so as a teenager now, Ebo started working out with his father early in the morning, and he hated those mornings. He dreaded those mornings. Orumila would have him running, stretching, lifting, cleaning himself up afterwards and getting ready for school while other kids was still waking up. Ebo thought, his father is so strict. Man, dad is so strict, right? But Orumila was teaching him another kind of offering, discipline. There were also times Orumila wouldn't let Ebo go out and about with his friends, you know, when they want to go out in the parking lot, go kicking it and turning up, going out to the bowling alley and turning up, you know, because there was a certain type of crowd that came within. Orumila just didn't want to risk that with his son. But Ebo was furious. Ebo was watching everybody outside kicking it, having a blast. Summers was going by. Everybody was out somewhere. Girls was calling. Music was playing. And Orumila would tell him, not today. Okay? Ebo thought his father was so controlling. Like, I can't do nothing. It was sweating me. What he didn't understand, though, was that sometimes isolation can sometimes be an offering, too. Sometimes what saves you is the places that you don't go, and the people that you don't get involved with. Ebo, now maturing into adolescence, found much of life's rewards were through the lessons that his father and the elders surrounding and within his environment taught him over the years. Orumila had been teaching his son that his entire life without ever sitting him down and saying, hey, this is an altar, this is a shrine, you must get up on this day, on this Shango day, and today we make offers for this. But he never put a name on it. It just was a way of life, you know. There are things that you cannot understand through explanation, and some things have to meet you where you are in life for you to get a full circumference of what it truly embodies within the depths of understanding it. And like that, eventually, Eku came to the neighborhood. Not wearing any robe. He didn't have a seat. He didn't have his little Grim Reaper outfit on, right? Nothing dramatic like that. But Eku came the way death usually comes into real communities. People he grew up with were experiencing death in the homes and in the lives of those close to him. he noticed that neighbors looked to his father Arumila for understanding and for comfort. So many people were coming at once, and it seemed very frequent now. An ambulance would come down the street one week, another 2 weeks, here goes a funeral procession that came through. Next thing you know, you're hearing about somebody's grandmother passing away quietly in her sleep. And he recognized the change, like a young man everybody knew growing up, killed unexpectedly. Crisis is happening. And when a child became seriously ill, the families of that child would come, to consult with his dad for understanding. Ebo started to notice, something that he had never really considered before was death. Death didn't have an age requirement. It seemed like people was going, at all different stages of their life. A person could breathe for 30 seconds. He knew a family who just had a baby, and now they were talking about burial arrangements for the child, right? He heard about children who would die, at the age of 8 from a heart attack. Or somebody could leave at 25. Somebody else could sit on the same porch until they're 98 years old. And that really troubled him. One evening, Ebo asked his father, how do you know when somebody who has died before their time has fully fulfilled their destiny? And Arumila looked at him for a while before even answering, and he said, essentially, son, you don't know. You really don't know. You can't really say whether someone has fulfilled their destiny. People like to measure whether an individual has fulfilled destiny by old age because that's how human beings understand time. We see somebody die young and say, they had so much life to live or gone too soon. And emotionally, for some, this makes sense because we're imagining everything we expected them to experience. However, that's not the truth. We are just trying to find ways to cope and grieve and find our own human understanding to things. Arumila challenged Ebo to think deeper, right? Consider if a child is only here for a week, but the child's existence completely transformed the mother and the father, and she finds out that she's contracted a virus that affected the child's ability to grow and develop. Imagine an entire medical system shifting to now testing and treatment for children are full panel tests being performed because of that one incident having occurred. The destiny of the child's life is greater than our own understanding. Ebo sat with that. It definitely was something that he had to accept and understand, because his father always, like usually, made sense. Days later, right, Ebo found himself sitting outside one afternoon playing Ayo. Ebo was really, really good at this game. He was so good playing this game. The neighborhood older men had taught him. Arumila sharpened him when he was growing up, right? Ayo required patience. You couldn't only look at what was directly in front of you. A careless move might look immediately and like the winning move, right? But it ultimately, like, you could destroy yourself easily with this game. But Ebo, he understood the game. That afternoon, while Ebo was deep into the game, an unfamiliar man walked up and stood near the table watching. He wasn't loud or aggressive or anything like that. He just carried himself like somebody who needed something to do for the evening. And so everybody, taking turns, he decided that he wanted to step in and play. So after watching a few rounds, the man asked, could he play? And Ebo moved over to make some room. What Ebo did not know was that the man sitting across from him was Iku, Death. Death had decided to visit Ebo. They played for a while, and Ebo quickly realized this man understood Ayo differently. Everybody else on the block had their ways of moving, but this guy, this Eku, right, he played a little different. Every time Ebo thought he had something set up, Eku would make a move that forced him to look all over again. Eventually, Ebo asked, who is you? Like, what's up? Who are you? And Eku told him, I'm Eku. What's up? You don't like nobody winning? That changed everything. The whole energy, at the table began to shift, and Ebo understood immediately that this game was no longer about who could really play better. Eku told him that he had been visiting the area for a while, and lately he had noticed people speaking about Ebo and his father's work. Eku noticed that Ebo was intervening in his path, right? Somebody would see Eku coming, run to Arumila and take consultation with Arumila, and their whole plan would change. People would seek help, making an offer, and listen to Arumila's advice, or to take shift in their behavior, their wellness, and death will be completely averted. This brought attention to Iku, so Iku had to come see it for itself. Then Iku told Ebo something that shook him. Every time those outcomes changed, Ebo Markins was all over it. Iku had recognized Ebo's power before Ebo had even recognized it himself. In that moment, Ebo realized carrying water to the elders, water to the creek, watering the plants, taking care of animals when he didn't even feel like doing any of that, getting up early, go work out, exercise with his father, taking walks on the stroll and stuff like that. All of the nights where he thought he was missing out, having fun, Arimala was teaching him that staying home would be beneficial later down the road, right? Arimala, his father, had been raising him to understand that sometimes what you tend to and what you protect can completely alter what happens next. Eku then made an offer. If Ebo won the game, Eku would have to honor their agreement and refrain from taking humanity according to the terms they had set. But if Ebo lost, Eku would take himself and Ebo to heaven. And if Ebo was removed from the world, humanity would lose the very mechanism that allowed sacrifice to intervene when circumstances were moving forward or toward destruction. Knowing immediately what that decision would save him from, now death was sitting across from Ebo, making ultimatums. When the game eventually came down to the question, Ebo did what his father had always taught him to do, and that was to make sacrifice. And that, to me, brings Òfún Osa, or Òfún Sa, right back to where we started. We come into the world through darkness, through the womb, before we ever see the light. We're so focused on the light at the end of the tunnel that we miss the sacrifices throughout the journey. Much of life works the same way. There are things being developed in us long before we understand why we even have to indulge and learn from them, to endure them, or to give something up for things. Sometimes we don't even think about, or even recognize the value of what is placed inside of us until life finally brings us to the moment that requires our attention. So when people say there is light at the end of the tunnel, I think of Òfún Osa. I think of how it reminds me of the tunnel itself matters as well as the light at the end. So what you may learn while you connect with this Odu is that if you are willing to sacrifice, and how well you have been prepared to make your next move, you may be exactly prepared for what is to come, what is waiting for you. You may be more prepared than you actually realize it, but you have to be willing to make that sacrifice to do it.